Hello everybody, welcome back to I Think My Fridge is Haunted, a very creepy podcast for very creepy people with me, your host, Gemma. Thanks for coming back to all our new subscribers. And if you're new here, hi. Let's talk about something really, really serious today. And this takes me back to high school when I had to talk about issues within the world. I remember, and this was in the 90s, we had to choose an issue and we had to talk about it in English class in an essay. And I remember this one coming up a lot. And the issue is the death penalty. Now, whether you're for or against the death penalty, this story has a little bit of a twist to it. And I really want your opinions. Now, let's go back to the 23rd of February 1986, and 26-year-old Maurine Hunsaker is working at her local gas station, what in Australia we would call a petrol station, and she lives in Salt Lake County. That day, Maurine was kidnapped and murdered, and the man that murdered her was 28-year-old Ralph Leroy Menzies. While I was researching this case, I found that there was a frustratingly small amount of information about Maurine herself. The vast majority of the information is about Menzies, her killer. We do know that Menzies kidnapped Maurine from her place of employment at the service station in Kearns, Utah, and held her hostage at a place called Big Cottonwood Canyon. He held her there for a whole night. And that must have been terrifying for her, not knowing whether she was going to live, whether she was going to be set free. Unfortunately, she was not set free. After holding her hostage for the entire night, Menzies strangled Maurine and cut her throat. In a 2024 article on the website Deseret.com, journalist Hanna Seariac talks to Maurine's son. He's actually one of her 3 children. Matt Hunsaker remembered his mum as a woman who loved her family and was an amazing person with a ready smile. He said she was the kind of mum that went to his baseball games all the time, and he said, quote, "She fought a lot to support her family. Who she taught me to be was great." And Matt was just 10 years old when she was taken away from their family. At the time that the perpetrator carried out this horrific kidnap and murder, Menzies was on parole from the Utah State Prison. Now, if you live in Australia, you know the problem that we're going through with countless violent crimes taking place by criminals that are on parole. And that's a whole other episode that we can get to at a later date. But that's not the only reason I'm recording this video today. I want your opinions on what is happening today in 2025 to this man, and I'm very interested to hear what you guys have to say. So here are a few more details about Ralph Leroy Menzies. He was born in Utah in 1958, and he did not come from a good home. His mother died when he was young, and he apparently had multiple stepfathers who abused and neglected him. He did not often go to school, and he and his sisters basically raised themselves. We can only fill in the blanks ourselves as to what happened in the years that followed his childhood. But at the time that he murdered Maurine, Menzies had been in prison serving not 1 but 2 sentences. He had 5 years to life for aggravated robberies that occurred in 1976 and 1978, and he had another sentence of 1 to 15 years because in 1978, he tried to escape prison along with another prisoner named Johnny Ray Sloan. 1 week after the escape, on the 17th of July, 1978, Menzies robbed and shot a taxi driver. So in 1979, he was given another 5 years. But after only 6 or so years in prison, Menzies was released on parole. And that took place on October 9th, 1984. Part of the parole agreement was that he had to report to a parole officer, and his parole officer was named John Shepard, and they regularly spoke. Shepard checked in on Menzies frequently, and he had no real reason to worry about his behaviour. Menzies was employed most of the time, and he wasn't really getting into trouble that Shepard knew of. Menzies was also required to go to therapy for his mental health, and he also had to live in a halfway house for the first month of his parole. In April 1985, his psychologist said that he no longer needed therapy. However, this took place even though Menzies had actually made a few mistakes during his parole. It turns out that in December 1984, just 2 months after getting out of prison, his parole officer John was contacted by a woman who said that Menzies had threatened her son with a firearm. However, after being detained at the Salt Lake County Jail, the alleged victim retracted his claim against Menzies. The case was dismissed and Menzies was released from county jail. And I suppose because the charges were dropped, no parole violation report was filed. Let's fast forward 5 months to May 1985. Menzies surrendered a pistol to his parole officer. The parole agreement prohibited him from carrying or owning a firearm. But Menzies said that he had taken the gun from another parolee because he was afraid that they would commit a crime with it. Well, parole officer Shepard believed him and no further action was taken. But 6 months later, in December 1985, John Shepard, the parole officer, found stolen items at Menzies' home, and these include tires and Christmas decorations. So Menzies was arrested and charged with theft and sent back to the Salt Lake County Jail. Shepard recommended from that point that Menzies should be placed on a more strict parole program, and it was called the Intensive Supervision Program. But sadly, it wasn't enough to prevent what was to happen next. Ralph Menzies ended up pleading guilty to attempted theft of the tyres, and he was to be sentenced in March of 1986. But during the time between his plea and the sentencing, he was released on 20th of February. And tragically, just 3 days later, on the 23rd of February 1986, Maurine Hunsaker was kidnapped and killed by Ralph Menzies. Now, on the day following that, on the 24th of February, Menzies was arrested in relation to the theft of those Christmas decorations. 3 days after that, on the 27th of February, the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office informed parole officer John Shepard that Ralph Menzies was a suspect in a murder case. Menzies was arrested and denied bail. He ended up being charged with capital homicide. In 1988, 2 years later, he was sentenced to the death penalty. And to date, he is Utah's longest-serving death row inmate. Because in the almost 40 years that have lapsed since his sentencing, Menzies has filed multiple appeals that have delayed his death sentence on 2 occasions. At this point, he has no more opportunities for appeal, and the state wants to get things moving on his execution. Until this happened. In 2024, the court ordered a competency hearing before the execution goes ahead, and the reason for this is because Menzies' lawyers claim that he has vascular dementia. Let's go through some problems that this presents. This case has not been straightforward for the Hunsaker family. They have campaigned for decades to get justice for Maurine's death. In this case, what they want to see eventuate is the death penalty in accordance with what the courts deemed sufficient in 1988. They're not campaigning about whether the death penalty is right or wrong. The family just wants the court to uphold the penalty it chose in this particular case. Because we have to ask the question, if a court can't uphold a sentence that it has instated, does that leave the families or victims feeling cheated of justice? Even before the sentencing in 1988, Maurine's family pointed out that the parole laws were not strong enough. And I don't think much has changed since then, to be honest. In June 1987, just over a year after Maurine's death, her husband filed a complaint against the state, saying that the parole process was negligent. He said that there was a failure to supervise Menzies under parole, especially since the reports were never written up for his small misdemeanors. So as a result, Menzies felt he could carry out a crime without getting caught. In this case, Maurine's kidnap and murder. In 1995, after Menzies' first stay of execution, Maurine's mother, Betty, told reporters that she was disappointed with the result and that, quote, Maurine had a very lovely family and a husband she adored. She had everything to live for. Mr. Menzies snuffed that out all at once. I wish he'd given her all the opportunities to live that he wants for himself. And she's got a really good point. Now, Maurine's mum, Betty, died in 2021 before seeing the sentence carried out in its entirety. Matt Hunsaker, Maurine's son, attends court appeals and has testified against anti-death penalty legislation because the family appear to want to get this execution done as it was set in the sentence. Matt says, quote, "I know that my grandma was adamant that she wanted to see him executed." Matt also says that his family wants to keep Maurine's legacy alive, aware that there are far more media articles on Menzies' death row plight than the woman that he actually killed. He said, "We visit her grave repeatedly and keep her memory alive. We make sure that anytime he's in the news and the focus is always on him, his rights, his appeals, I do my hardest to make sure that it's reminded who he killed." He went on to say, "I respect and understand that the system has to make sure everything is done correctly, but when someone's guilty and undoubtedly guilty, they did it. There shouldn't be 30 years of process." So regardless of your opinion on whether or not you're for the death penalty, let's talk about this case in particular, and I really want to hear your opinions. Ralph Menzies, who is now 69 years of age, selected the firing squad himself as the method of his execution. Because he was sentenced before May 2004, he was given the choice between firing squad and lethal injection. Prisoners who were sentenced after that date must be executed by lethal injection unless those drugs are not available. And this is a whole other episode. The death penalty can be a complete mess at times, and it's something that I really want to talk more about. It's very, very interesting in a macabre way, and I think it needs to be talked about. It is a mess. According to CBS, Menzies is one of 10 people scheduled to be executed in the US over the remainder of 2025, and that is spread over 7 different states. So far this year, 25 men have been executed by court order. That seems like a lot to me, so I did some research to compare with previous years. In 2015, 28 people were executed in the US. In 2021, it was 11, the fewest number of executions within a single year since 1988. And in 2024, 25 people were executed. Now, this marked an odd commemoration because it was the 10th year in a row that the US had executed less than 30 people. Now, that commemoration will probably be broken this year, bringing the total in 2025 to 35 executions if they all go ahead. The majority of these executions took place via lethal injection, and a small few via nitrogen hypoxia. I suppose we can call this a gas chamber type execution, I suppose. It deprives the lungs of oxygen, leading to asphyxiation. It's not a nice way to go, and there has been a lot of debate as to whether this is an ethical way to execute a criminal. And I think that's why it tends to be used much less frequently. Firing squad is also used far less these days. South Carolina executed 2 men earlier this year via firing squad, but in Utah, it was last used 15 years ago in 2010. Idaho, Mississippi, and Oklahoma are the only other states that allow firing squad executions. And although you would think that the United States would have excellent marksmen within its employ, you'd apparently be wrong. One of the men executed in South Carolina earlier this year, his name was Mikhail Mardi, and he was 41 years of age. It was observed that he was still conscious for up to a minute after he was fired at, since the firing squad had missed his heart. Now, Mardi, like Menzies, chose the firing squad as his method of execution. His other choices were lethal injection and the electric chair, which I didn't know that they still used, but apparently they do. Ralph Menzies' execution is set for the 5th of September, which is about 6.5 weeks from the time I'm recording this. But his lawyers now say that his dementia diagnosis constitutes a reason to cancel his execution. Judge Matthew Bates signed Menzies' death warrant, and last month he stated that Menzies, quote, consistently and rationally, unquote, understands why he faces execution despite his diagnosis. What I think he's saying is, yes, he has dementia, but he's not that far along. He also said, quote, Menzies has not shown a preponderance of the evidence that his understanding of his specific crime and punishment has fluctuated or declined in a way that offends the 8th Amendment. Menzies' attorneys say that he has to use a wheelchair as well as oxygen and that he cannot understand his legal case. They said, quote, "We remain hopeful that the courts or the clemency board will recognise the profound inhumanity of executing a man who is experiencing steep cognitive decline and a significant memory loss. Taking the life of someone with a terminal illness who is no longer a threat to anyone and whose mind and identity have been overtaken by dementia serves neither justice nor human decency." So what do you think? This man kidnapped and murdered an innocent woman who was a wife and a mum of 3. Does he deserve any less than a death sentence? Or, after 38 years in prison, is it worth just letting him die of natural causes? Should there be clemency for such cases as this? I'm really interested to see what you fridgies have to say. Please leave your comments in the comments section below if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, be creepy, but don't be a creep. Bye everyone.